What would you do if the world you knew was stripped away, leaving you with nothing but a memory and a ruin? Imagine your family, your home, your rightful inheritance, all signed over to a man who saw you as little more than a nuisance. And as a final act of contempt, you were handed the deed to the one thing on the property everyone agreed was worthless, your father's old, rotting barn, for the insulting sum of a single silver dollar. But the truth waiting inside that splintered, forgotten wood was a secret that would not only rewrite a family's history, but stun an entire town into silence. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Ilara Vance and the inheritance no one wanted. Ilara Vance stood on the rise overlooking what was no longer her home. The dust of the long road from the east still settled in the folds of her gray dress, a film of grit that felt like a second skin. Before her lay the Vance Ranch, a spread of land her father had carved from the unblinking wilderness with his own two hands. Now it belonged to her uncle. Silas Vance stood on the porch of the main house, a solid, unmoving shape against the familiar pine door. He held the papers in one hand and a self-satisfied certainty in his eyes. He'd been quick, arriving just days after the telegram about her father's passing, his lawyer from the city already holding the documents that claimed the entire ranch against a series of supposed debts her father had owed him. Debts Ilara had never heard of. "It's all settled, girl," Silas said, his voice carrying too easily on the dry air. It was a voice made for pronouncements, not comfort. "The place is barely solvent. I'm doing you a favor, taking it on." Ilara said nothing. She looked past him, at the corrals her father had mended every spring, at the small vegetable garden her mother had tended before she too was gone, now choked with weeds. Her gaze settled on the great barn at the edge of the property, its back to the main house, facing the open expanse of the plains. It was a silver-gray ghost, its roofline sagging in the middle like the spine of an old, tired horse. Shingles were missing. One of the great doors hung from a single hinge. It was the oldest structure on the land, the first thing her father had built. "You get your personal things from the house. One trunk," Silas continued, gesturing dismissively. "And, as a gesture of family feeling, I'll let you have the old barn. The deed is right here. Cost you $1. He held out a freshly inked paper and a silver dollar he'd clearly brought for the occasion. It was a performance of magnanimity that was really just a twisting of the knife. The barn was a liability. Everyone knew it was a teardown, useful only for firewood, and it would take more effort to dismantle than it was worth. Giving it to her was a way of giving her nothing, a way of branding her with the symbol of decay and ruin. Her throat was tight, a knot of grief and rage she refused to let him see. She remembered her father's hands, calloused and gentle, how he would sometimes disappear into that barn for hours, the scent of pine shavings and something else, something sweet like amber, clinging to his clothes when he returned. He called it his thinking place. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, her as a small child, asking to go inside with him. "Not yet, little bird," he'd murmured, his eyes distant. "Some things need silence to grow." She had never understood. Now, standing before her uncle, the barn seemed to be the only piece of that silence left. She walked forward, her boots scuffing the dirt. She took the deed. She took the dollar from his palm and placed it back into his hand. The coin was warm from his skin. "Keep it," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Consider it payment for the view." She turned without another word, leaving him standing there, the silver dollar glinting uselessly in the harsh afternoon sun. She had her trunk, the clothes on her back, and a deed to a ruin. And as she walked toward the sagging gray structure, she felt not the weight of what she had lost, but the strange, unsettling pull of the one thing she had left. The next morning, under a sky the color of washed-out denim, Ilara stood before the barn. It was larger up close, more intimidating. The wind whispered through the gaps in its siding, a low, mournful sound. The wood, weathered by decades of sun and snow, was grooved and split, a map of forgotten seasons. The main door, the one still attached, groaned in protest as she put her shoulder to it, the sound of deep rust and old pain. It moved just enough for her to slip through the opening. Inside, the air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of old hay, dust, and the faint, dry smell of animal musk. Shafts of light cut through the gloom from the broken roof, illuminating dancing motes of dust like tiny captured stars. The ground floor was vast and mostly empty, save for a few rotting stalls and a pile of stiff, forgotten harnesses in a corner. It was a place of endings, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw a movement in the far stall. A soft wicker. Standing in the deepest shadow was a horse, a sway-backed mare with a coat the color of faded buckskin and one cloudy blue eye. Willow. Her father's old mare, too old for ranch work, too gentle for anything but a slow walk. Silas hadn't even bothered to take her. The horse lifted her head, her good eye watching Ilara with a weary sort of kindness. Ilara felt the knot in her throat loosen just a little. She wasn't entirely alone. She walked over and ran a hand down the mare's bony flank. The horse leaned into her touch, a silent communion of the discarded. Ilara spent the day simply inhabiting the space, walking its perimeter, letting its emptiness seep into her. She climbed the rickety ladder to the loft, testing each rung before putting her weight on it. The loft was a cavern of shadows, stretching the full length of the barn. Piles of brittle hay lay in drifts, and old tools, a rusted pitchfork, a broken scythe, leaned against the walls. It was just as useless as it appeared from the outside. Disappointment, cold and sharp, settled in her chest. She had hoped for, she didn't know what. Some sign of her father, some hidden meaning. But there was nothing, just dust and decay. She sat on the edge of the loft, her legs dangling over the empty space below, and watched the light shift as the sun made its way across the sky. The sheer scale of her loss felt immense, as vast and empty as the barn itself. She could leave. She could sell the deed for a pittance and take a stagecoach to some city where no one knew her name. The thought was tempting, a brief flicker of escape. But where would she go? What would she do? Everything she was, everything she knew, was tied to this land, this sky, this silence. Leaving felt like a second death, the final erasure of her father's memory and her own past. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange along the horizon, she made a decision. She would stay. She would fix the roof. She would mend the door. She would care for the old mare. This ruin was hers, and she would not let it fall. She would hold on to this last broken piece of her father, and she would make it whole. What is it that makes us choose the difficult path, the one of labor and uncertainty over the easy road of departure? Is it stubbornness, or is it a deeper kind of faith? What secret could a place like this possibly hold, and what would it demand of her to uncover it? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and quiet resolve. Now, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ilara's real work was just beginning. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, a collection of false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support against the constant wind. News traveled fast in a place that small, carried on whispers from the general store to the saloon. By the time Ilara made her first trip into town for supplies, a sack of oats for Willow, flour, salt, and a box of nails, her story had already preceded her. She was the Vance girl, the one whose uncle had swindled her out of the ranch and left her with the old, collapsed barn. She felt their eyes on her as she tied Willow to the hitching post. They were looks of pity mixed with a kind of morbid curiosity. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale. In the general store, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face was a permanent mask of mild disapproval, counted out her change with slow, deliberate movements. "Heard you're staying out at the old place," he said, not quite meeting her eye. "Brave of you. Most folks would have torn it down years ago." The word brave was meant to sound like foolish. Ilara simply nodded, tucking the coins into her pocket. "It needs a roof," she said, her voice even. The simplicity of the statement seemed to throw him. He just grunted in response. As she was loading her supplies onto Willow's back, a heavy hand fell on her shoulder. She turned to see her uncle, Silas, standing there with two of his new ranch hands. He was smiling, a wide, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, look here," Silas boomed, loud enough for half the street to hear. "My dear niece, the proud landowner. How's the mansion holding up? The wind find its way through all the walls yet?" His men chuckled, a harsh, dry sound. Ilara stood her ground, her gaze fixed on him. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She just waited, her silence a wall he could not seem to breach. "Still not talking?" he taunted. "Just like your father. Always off in his own world, tinkering with his worthless projects in that old heap. Stubborn fool, the both of you. You'll be begging me for a roof over your head before the first snow. Mark my words." He gave her shoulder a final, condescending pat and swaggered off toward the saloon, his men trailing behind him like vultures. The townspeople who had been watching quickly looked away, busying themselves with their own affairs. No one wanted to be seen taking her side against Silas Vance, the new owner of the biggest ranch in the valley. As she was about to mount Willow, a quiet voice spoke from the shadows of the livery stable. "He talks loud to hide a small soul." Ilara turned to see an old woman sitting on a bench, her face a beautiful lacework of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She was called Mary Standing Alone by the townsfolk, a native woman who lived on her own at the edge of the territory and rarely came to town. She was wrapped in a faded blanket, her hands resting on a walking stick. Ilara had only seen her from a distance before. The old woman looked from Ilara to the barn, visible as a gray smudge on the horizon. "Your father was a good man," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "He listened to the wood. Not many men do." She paused, her gaze turning back to Ilara, sharp and penetrating. "Some timbers hold more than a roof," she said. "They hold a song." And with that, she stood, gave a slow, deliberate nod, and walked away, her form disappearing around the corner of the building. Ilara stood frozen for a moment, the woman's words echoing in her mind. They hold a song. It made no sense. It was just a cryptic saying from a strange old woman. Yet the phrase stuck with her, a small, persistent burr under the skin of her thoughts as she rode back toward her ruin, the mockery of the town still ringing in her ears. The journey back was not a ride home, but a passage into a different state of being. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the prairie. With every step Willow took, the sounds of redemption, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the faint shouts from the saloon, faded, replaced by the rhythmic creak of leather and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Ilara felt the shift inside her. The town was a place of judgment, of stares and whispers that tried to define her by her loss. Out here, there was only the land, the sky, and the silent, dilapidated structure waiting for her on the horizon. The barn was no longer just a building. It was a border. Crossing onto its patch of land was like stepping into another country, one where she was the sole citizen. She dismounted, leading Willow not to the broken stall inside but to a small, sheltered patch of grass on the leeward side of the barn, where a small spring trickled from a cluster of rocks. Her father had always said it was the sweetest water in the valley. She filled a bucket for the mare and one for herself, the water cold and clean against her throat. That night, she didn't sleep in the loft. The thought of the unstable floorboards and the gaping holes in the roof was too unsettling. Instead, she laid her bedroll on the earthen floor of the ground level, in a corner swept clean of the worst of the debris. Willow was tethered just outside the open doorway, her slow, rhythmic chewing a comforting presence in the immense silence. The barn was a different creature at night. The moonlight, filtered through the broken slats, painted silver stripes across the floor. The wind, which had been a whisper during the day, now moaned and keened around the corners, making the old timbers groan and settle like a sleeping giant. Every sound was magnified. The scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft sigh of the old mare. Lying there, wrapped in her blankets, Ilara felt a profound and aching loneliness. The full weight of her situation pressed down on her. She was a woman alone, with no money, no allies, and a shelter that was barely a shelter at all. The mockery of her uncle felt less like an insult, and more like a simple statement of fact. What was she doing here? What possible future could she build from these rotting planks? Her father's face swam in her memory. Not his face at the end, worn and tired, but the way he looked when he was working, his brow furrowed in concentration, a small smile playing on his lips as he planed a piece of wood or tightened a joint. He had always been a man of quiet purpose. She had loved him for it, but she had never truly understood it. He had seemed content with his small world, his ranch, his family, his barn. He had never spoken of ambition or wealth. Silas saw that as a weakness, a lack of drive. Now, lying in the dark heart of her father's most private place, Ilara wondered if it wasn't a weakness at all. Perhaps it was a different kind of strength, one she had yet to comprehend. Sleep did not come easily. The barn seemed to be breathing around her, its wooden lungs expanding and contracting with the shifting night air. She felt like a trespasser in its history, a small, insignificant speck in the face of its long, slow decay. The initial hope she had felt, that flicker of defiance, seemed to be guttering out, leaving only the cold reality of her predicament. The disappointment was a physical weight in her chest. The barn was just a barn, old, broken, and empty. There was no secret here. There was only the long, hard work of survival. Just before dawn, she finally drifted into a restless sleep, the last thing she heard being the soft, mournful song of the wind whistling through a crack in the wall. Days turned into a week, and the week began to blur into a rhythm of labor. Ilara's life became a simple, repeating pattern of mending and tending. Each morning began with the sun. She would fetch water, check on Willow, and eat a small breakfast of hardtack and dried apples. Then, the work would begin. Her first priority was the roof. Using a salvaged ladder and a dwindling supply of nails, she began the painstaking process of replacing the most rotten shingles with planks she scavenged from the collapsed interior stalls. It was slow, dangerous work. Her hands, soft from her years back east, were soon raw, then calloused. Her muscles ached with a deep, unfamiliar fire. Yet, with every nail she hammered home, she felt a small, fierce spark of satisfaction. She was not just patching holes. She was reclaiming something. One afternoon, while working on the high peak of the roof directly over the loft, her hammer slipped. It bounced once and then clattered down, not to the loft floor below, but into a dark space between the main roof beam and the western wall. She cursed under her breath. It was her only hammer. Carefully, she made her way down the ladder and into the loft. The space where the hammer had fallen was a strange, tight angle, a dark wedge where the massive central truss met the outer wall. It wasn't a natural gap. It looked intentional. Most of the barn's construction was rough-hewn, practical. But here the joinery was different. The beams were smoother, fitted together with a precision that was completely out of place with the rest of the structure. She ran her hand along the wood. It was a different type of wood, too. Not the pine and fir that made up the rest of the frame, but something harder, darker, with a fine, tight grain. It felt smooth and cool beneath her scraped fingers. Peering into the darkness, she could just make out the shape of her hammer lying on a surface a few feet below. It hadn't fallen all the way to the ground floor. It was resting on some kind of hidden subfloor or platform. Curiosity piqued. She fetched her lantern, even though it was the middle of the day. Lighting the wick, she held it up to the gap. The flickering light illuminated a small, enclosed space, no bigger than a closet. And in that space, she saw not only her hammer, but something else. A neat stack of wooden boards, planed and sanded, leaning against the far wall, and next to them, a small, leather-bound book. She felt a tremor of excitement, the first real stirring of something other than grim determination she'd felt in weeks. This was it. This was the anomaly, the detail that refused to fit. The strange, precise joinery, the different, finer wood, the hidden, inaccessible space. It was all a deliberate concealment. The words of the old woman, Mary standing alone, came back to her. He listened to the wood. Some timbers hold more than a roof. She looked around the loft, seeing it now with new eyes. It wasn't just a hay storage area. The light from the west-facing wall, where she'd patched the largest hole, fell directly on this strange corner. The ventilation from the eaves seemed to be designed to keep this specific area dry and temperate. The entire structure of the loft seemed subtly, secretly, built around this one hidden point. She did not act immediately. The discovery was too large, too strange to be rushed. She retrieved her hammer using a long piece of wire, her mind racing. For the rest of the day, as she worked, she felt the presence of that hidden space, a silent, waiting secret in the heart of her inheritance. That night, she didn't sleep on the ground floor. She brought her bedroll up to the loft and laid it out near the strange corner, as if standing vigil. The barn no longer felt empty. It felt like it was holding its breath. The next morning, Ilara did not begin her work on the roof. The pull of the hidden space was too strong to ignore. She gathered her tools, a pry bar, her hammer, and the lantern. Her heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She felt like an archaeologist approaching a tomb, a place of reverence and long-held silence. Willow, sensing the shift in her mood, stood at the base of the ladder, her good eye fixed on Ilara's ascent, a silent, watchful companion. Reaching the strange corner, Ilara took a deep breath. She began by examining the outer wall. From the inside, it appeared to be a solid plank wall like any other. But tapping on it, she could hear a subtle difference in the sound, a hollow resonance that wasn't present anywhere else. Running her hands over the surface, her fingers found it. A slight seam, almost invisible, where one wide plank met another. There were no visible hinges, no handle, no lock. It was masterfully concealed. It was not meant to be found by accident. She worked carefully, inserting the thin edge of the pry bar into the hairline crack. She didn't want to break it. This was her father's work, and whatever he had hidden with care. The wood resisted. It took all her strength, leveraging her body against the bar, before she heard a faint groan, then a soft click. A hidden wooden latch had released. The section of the wall swung inward, silent on well-oiled, concealed hinges. It was not a door, but a perfectly balanced piece of the wall itself. The air that flowed out of the space was cool and dry, carrying an extraordinary scent. Not the must of old hay, but the rich, complex aroma of aged wood, of resin, and something else she couldn't name. Something like spice and honey. It was the scent she remembered from her father's clothes, magnified 100 times. She lifted the lantern, holding it in the opening. The light fell upon a scene that made her gasp. It was a workshop, a small, perfect, secret world, a luthier's workshop. Hanging in a neat row from wooden pegs were violins, at least a dozen of them, in various stages of completion. Their bodies glowed in the lantern light, the wood a symphony of amber, copper, and deep, rich brown. On a workbench below them lay the intricate tools of the trade. Tiny curved planes, calipers, delicate saws, jars of varnish that shone like liquid gold. Curled shavings of pale wood lay on the floor like fallen leaves, and leaning against the wall was the stack of wood she had seen from above. Thin, perfectly cut billets of maple and spruce, aged to a pale, creamy color. This was what her father had done in his hours of solitude. He wasn't just a rancher who tinkered. He was an artist, a master craftsman. He had built this secret sanctuary inside the rough shell of the barn, a place of quiet, dedicated creation. On the workbench, next to a half-finished violin, lay the leather-bound book she had glimpsed. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was a journal. She opened it to the first page. The script was her father's, neat and precise. The entry was dated 20 years earlier. It read, "Found the stand of maple today, high on the north face of the mountain, where the wind is cruelest. The wood will be hard. It will have a voice like a high, clear bell. It will be worth the climb." She sank to the floor, the journal in her lap, the scent of seasoned wood all around her. This wasn't just a barn, it was a cathedral of sound, and she was sitting in its hidden heart. Ilara lost track of time in the secret workshop. Page after page of her father's journal revealed the depth of his secret passion. He documented his trips into the high mountains to find the perfect trees, his experiments with varnishes made from local pine resin and beeswax, his detailed drawings of scrolls and F-holes. He wrote not like a hobbyist, but like a scholar, a man obsessed with the pursuit of a perfect sound. He had taught himself, learning from old books he'd ordered from back east, slowly and patiently mastering a craft that had no place in the rough world of ranching. That was why he'd hidden it. It was a part of himself too quiet, too fine for the world he lived in. A world that included men like Silas. The last entry was dated just a month before he died. "The winter maple is ready. I believe this one will be the best yet. I will make it for Ilara. She has music in her, even if she doesn't know it." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the words. He had been making a violin for her. She found it on the bench, its body assembled but not yet varnished, the pale wood seeming to hold a silent, waiting breath. She ran her fingers over its smooth, curved surface. It felt alive. The discovery changed everything. The barn was no longer a burden, but a vessel. Her work took on a new urgency, a new meaning. She was no longer just protecting a shelter. She was guarding a legacy. She patched the roof with a fierce determination, ensuring no drop of rain could touch the precious wood inside. She repaired the great door, resetting the heavy hinge so it swung smoothly and could be barred from the inside. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a purpose that warmed her better than any fire. She lived on meager rations, but she felt fuller than she had in years. The secret was a companion, a quiet hum of energy that filled the vast emptiness of the barn. But the seasons wait for no one. As autumn deepened, the sky grew colder, the wind carrying the first sharp bite of winter. The old-timers in town spoke of a hard season coming, pointing to the thick coats on the coyotes and the early migration of the geese. Ilara knew the barn, even with her repairs, was vulnerable. A heavy snow or a fierce blizzard could still bring it down. The storm arrived without warning. It began as a whisper of snow in the late afternoon, then thickened into a blinding, swirling wall of white. The wind howled, a physical force that slammed against the barn, making the entire structure shudder and groan. Ilara had brought Willow inside, settling her in the most sheltered stall with fresh hay and water. The temperature plummeted. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the walls, stealing the warmth from her body. She lit her lantern in the workshop, the small space a haven of calm against the raging chaos outside. She sat with her father's journal, the violins gleaming around her like silent guardians. But the storm was relentless. A sudden violent gust tore at the roof, and with a sound like a gunshot, one of her newly patched sections ripped away. Snow and wind blasted into the loft. Panic seized her. The wood, the violins, her father's entire life's work was exposed. She had to protect it. Grabbing a heavy canvas tarp, she fought her way into the main part of the loft, the wind tearing at her clothes, the snow stinging her face. She managed to drag the tarp over the exposed area, weighing it down with old tools and broken beams, her fingers numb, her body shaking with cold and exertion. Just as she secured the last corner, she heard a new sound over the roar of the wind, a desperate, frantic banging on the main door. Her blood ran cold. Who could be out in this? Silas? Some drifter? She hesitated, fear warring with a deeper instinct. The banging came again, weaker this time, followed by a faint cry. Taking a deep breath, she unbarred the door. A man, covered in snow, practically fell inside, half carrying a woman who was clutching a small, bundled child. Their faces were blue with cold, their eyes wide with fear. "Please," the man stammered, his teeth chattering. "Our wagon. It broke an axle. We saw your light." They were travelers, a family caught in the storm's fury. Without a second thought, Ilara helped him bring his wife and child further inside, out of the wind. The woman was barely conscious, the child eerily still. They needed warmth, and they needed it now. She led them to the most secure ground floor stall, stuffing it with hay for insulation. She gave them her own blankets, rubbing the child's small frozen hands between her own until a flicker of life returned. As she worked to save them, huddled in the fragile shelter of the groaning barn, she knew this was the test. It wasn't just about protecting the past. It was about using its strength to shelter the living. The blizzard raged for 2 days. Ilara, the man who introduced himself as Thomas, his wife Mary, and their young son Samuel, survived in the cavernous belly of the barn. They huddled together for warmth, sharing Ilara's meager supplies. The old mare, Willow, was a steady breathing furnace in the stall next to them, her quiet presence a comfort against the storm's violence. Thomas, a quiet, thoughtful man, watched Ilara with a look of growing respect as she moved about the barn, checking the tarp on the roof, reinforcing a wall that was threatening to buckle, her movements economical and sure. She was no longer the lost, grieving daughter. She was the steadfast guardian of this place. On the third morning, they woke to an almost deafening silence. The wind had died. The world outside was a blanket of pure, unbroken white. The storm had passed. As the sun rose, casting a brilliant, crystalline light, Thomas helped Ilara clear the snow from the door. He looked at the barn, its gray wood stark against the snow, a solitary sentinel in the vast white landscape. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This place, it may not look like much, but it's strong." Once the roads were passable, news of the stranded family and their rescue reached redemption. The story was told first by Thomas himself when he went to the blacksmith to get his axle repaired. He spoke of the girl in the old Vance barn, how she had taken them in without hesitation, how she had fought the storm to keep the roof over their heads. The townspeople, who had dismissed her as a fool, listened with a new kind of attention. The narrative began to shift. She wasn't just the crazy girl living in a ruin. She was a survivor, a person of quiet strength. A few days later, A buggy pulled up to the barn. A man in a city coat stepped out, introducing himself as Dr. Albright. He'd heard Mary and the child had been near frozen and had come to check on them. After examining them and declaring them well on the mend, his gaze fell upon Thomas, who was idly plucking a tune on a small, battered fiddle he'd pulled from his wagon. Thomas smiled sheepishly. "I'm a musician," he explained. "Or I was. Heading west for a new start." Curious, Ilara felt a sudden impulse. "Wait here," she said. She climbed to the loft and returned a moment later, holding one of her father's finished violins. She held it out to him. Would you play this?" Thomas took the instrument with a musician's reverence, his eyes widening as he felt its weight and balance. He ran his fingers along the neck, his expression changing from curiosity to awe. He lifted his bow and drew it across the strings. A note emerged, a sound so pure, so rich and resonant, it seemed to hang in the cold air like a perfect crystal. It filled the vast space of the barn, a voice of profound beauty and sorrow. He played a simple folk melody, but the violin transformed it, giving it a depth and power that stunned everyone into silence. When he finished, there were tears in his eyes. "My God," he whispered, looking at the violin as if it were a holy relic. "I have played instruments in the finest halls in Boston. I have never heard a tone like this. The wood, it sings. Who made this?" "My father," Ilara said softly. The story, now amplified by the violin's miraculous voice, spread like wildfire. The instrument became a local legend. People who had once mocked her now spoke of the Vance violin in hushed, reverent tones. A week later, another stranger arrived, this time a well-dressed man who introduced himself as a luthier from a major city back east, sent by a telegram from Thomas. He spent an entire day in the workshop, examining the tools, the wood, and the finished instruments with the focused intensity of a scholar. When he emerged, he sought out Ilara. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable excitement. "Your father was not just a craftsman. He was a genius. The wood he chose, the varnish he developed. It's unique. These instruments are not merely valuable. They are priceless. A legacy." Silas Vance heard the news, of course. He rode out to the barn one afternoon, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a confused, unsettled look. He stood at the threshold, peering into the space he had dismissed as worthless, and saw the quiet, determined woman his niece had become. He saw the rescued family, packing their mended wagon. He heard the faint, beautiful echo of the music. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a fool, but the heir to a kingdom he had been too blind to see. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Humbled and silenced, he simply turned his horse and rode away. The laughter of the town had turned to wonder, their pity to respect. Ilara had not needed to say a word. The barn and the song it held had spoken for her. The seasons turned. The snows melted, feeding the small spring and turning the valley a vibrant green. The family she had rescued, the Thomases, moved on, but not before Thomas, with tears in his eyes, promised to tell the world of the master luthier of redemption. He left her with his own humble fiddle, a token of his immense gratitude. Word of her father's work continued to spread, carried by letters and travelers. Experts and collectors wrote to her, making offers that could have bought her the old ranch 10 times over. But Ilara refused them all. The violins were not for sale. They were not commodities. They were her father's voice, and she was now their keeper. She spent her days not just maintaining the barn, but inhabiting the workshop. She read her father's journal from cover to cover, absorbing his knowledge, his patience, his reverence for the wood. She learned the names of the tools, the feel of them in her hand. She started with the simple tasks, sanding a piece of scrap maple until it was smooth as glass, learning the smell of the varnish as it dried. The townspeople, who once avoided her, now came by on occasion, leaving small gifts on her doorstep: a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a bundle of firewood. They didn't ask to see the workshop or the violins. It was a quiet offering of respect, an apology for their earlier judgment. They had come to understand that the barn was not just a building, but a sanctuary, and they honored its privacy. One evening, at golden hour, the light slanted through the western wall, filling the loft with a warm, amber glow. It illuminated the dust motes, turning them into a glittering cascade. Ilara stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by the silent, gleaming instruments. She held the unfinished violin in her hands, the one her father had started for her. Over the past months, she had worked on it, following the notes in his journal, her hands slowly learning the rhythms of the craft. It was nearly finished. She ran her hand over the smooth, pale wood, feeling the faint vibrations of the world outside, the lowing of a distant cow, the call of a meadowlark, the rustle of the wind in the new leaves. The world was full of sound, of music. Her father had known that. He hadn't hidden himself away out of shame or fear, but out of love. He had been protecting something delicate, coaxing it into existence in the one place quiet enough for it to grow. She looked out the opening in the loft, across the greening land that had once been hers. She felt no bitterness, no regret. Her uncle had the land, the house, the fences, but he had none of the richness she now held in her hands. He had inherited property. She had inherited a purpose. She lifted the violin, holding it under her chin, feeling its perfect, weightless balance. A quiet apotheosis. He didn't leave me a barn, she thought. He left me a voice. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet strength and hidden treasures. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest legacies are often found not in what is loud and seen, but in what is patiently and lovingly built in the silence. If this story moved you, please consider leaving a like and a comment below, and subscribe for more tales of the enduring human spirit. We'll see you next time.